shut up and hand over all company property. That was the moment Beatrice, the founder's mother, decided to make her grand stand. She screamed it like we were in the middle of a high-stakes hostage negotiation, but in reality, we were just standing in the second-floor break room. We were right next to the vending machines, and a chafing dish of lukewarm scrambled eggs that looked like they had given up on life. Half of our 52 staff members still had maple syrup on their mouths from the team appreciation waffles when Beatrice slammed her bony little fist on the card table and terminated me in front of everyone. There was no warning, no private discussion in an office, just decaf coffee in styrofoam cups, cheap paper plates, and a public execution in front of interns who still had their orientation name tags clipped to their belt loops. She did not even look me in the eye when she said it. She just stared right past me like I was a fogged-up bathroom mirror she was finished wiping down. "Your bloated overhead is dragging us down," she added. Her nose wrinkled like someone had just released an unpleasant odor into her personal space. I stood there, still holding a small paper cup of orange juice while her voice bounced off the stained acoustic ceiling tiles. The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the refrigerator. But here is the thing. I did not feel rage. I did not feel heartbreak or confusion. All I felt was a deep, overwhelming sense of relief. You see, I had spent 19 long years building this company from the ground up, managing the facilities and operations like a detailed catalog. I knew every single bolt, I had vetted every contractor, and I had filed every property lease in triplicate, neatly paper-clipped by color. Now this family matriarch, a woman who once asked me if Ethernet was a type of organic yogurt, had decided she could run the entire ship. It was almost cute. So I smiled quietly, took a paper napkin, and wiped my fingers. I walked over to the folding table where she stood, and I gently laid down my security badge like it was a prayer card at a funeral. Then I asked one simple question. I did not raise my voice, and I did not make a dramatic gesture. I just spoke clearly enough to cut the heavy silence right in half. If my overhead is so bloated, then why did 4 of our quarterly lease payments go to Stone Lake Holdings LLC? The chewing stopped instantly. Forks froze mid-air. Have you ever watched a fire alarm blink for a few seconds before the siren actually starts? That is exactly what Beatrice's face did. Her mouth twitched like she was about to laugh it off, but then the meaning of my words unwrapped itself behind her eyes, and she blinked twice. She looked down at her legal pad, like maybe the answer was scribbled there between a muffin recipe and a list of people who still returned her phone calls. But I did not wait around for the light bulb to turn on in her head. I just turned around, grabbed my leather briefcase, and walked out. I was as calm as a comma. On my way to the exit, I passed Timothy from the finance department. He looked like someone had just whispered a classified war crime into his ear. I gave him a quick wink and said, "Check the routing numbers, Timothy." The security guards did not try to stop me. They watched me walk by like I was carrying something dangerous, but nobody dared to touch me. I had been there 19 years, after all. I was already halfway down the corridor when my phone buzzed in my pocket with a text message from Diane in the Human Resources Department. "What on earth just happened?" she wrote. I typed back 2 words. "Watch payments." I did not drive home. Instead, I drove straight to my lawyer's office downtown. Nancy had hot coffee waiting for me and the good kind of professional silence. I sat down, opened my briefcase, pulled out a thick manila folder labeled Lease Agreement version 3, and slid it across her mahogany desk. Inside were the documents that the company executives had signed but never actually read, never questioned, and never understood. Because while Beatrice was busy updating her social media status to reflect her new self-appointed chief executive officer vibes, I had spent years quietly embedding myself into every single square foot of that building like termite DNA. And when I stood in that break room, with the staff still wiping waffle syrup off their chins, I knew exactly what I was doing. Because Stone Lake Holdings LLC was not some anonymous corporate landlord. It was mine. I walked into my new office suite, which I had leased months ago through another small holding company. The smell of fresh paint and new possibilities was in the air. I looked out the window at the skyline, feeling a quiet satisfaction. I had prepared for this moment for a long time. The board and the executives thought they had cut a loose thread, but they were about to discover I was the seam holding their entire operation together. They had underestimated the quiet man who managed their office space, and they were about to pay the price. Price. By 10:24 in the morning, Beatrice was pacing the corporate boardroom like a wild animal with a flashlight. Somewhere between firing me and finishing her lukewarm decaf, she had decided she wanted immediate access to everything I had managed. That was a major problem for her, because I was the sole administrator of about 93% of the company's operational backbone. Scott and the rest of the information technology team had pulled her into the conference room and hooked up a laptop, trying every administrative credential they could dig out of the dusty corners of their Active Directory database. Nothing worked. They had no access to the facility's control panel, no access to the digital lease archives, and the project tracker was locked behind a secure firewall with two-factor authentication that Beatrice could not begin to spell, let alone bypass. The junior office staff even tried guessing my old passwords, typing in combinations like my first name followed by 123, or just the word password itself. They really thought I was that simple. I had survived 5 separate external security audits and a chief financial officer who once typed his login credentials into a fake electronic invoice. I was many things, but stupid was definitely not one of them. Beatrice snapped at Scott, telling him to just override the system security. Scott, who possessed the social courage of a damp cracker, stammered and explained that the system was linked to my physical security key and my personal mobile phone, which was now deactivated. Beatrice cut him off with a sharp flick of her fingers, telling him to forget it and call the legal team. The legal team, which consisted of 4 corporate lawyers who mostly spent their days repeating compliance regulations, came back with the first falling domino. They could not find the most recent lease agreement anywhere. It was not in the shared network drive. It was not in the cloud folders, and it was not in the physical binders. They had tasked an intern with updating those binders, but he thought lease management was a software program and spent weeks entering software licenses into a spreadsheet instead. So the lawyers had to dig deeper. They scanned the financial ledgers, printed out vendor reports, and ran payment histories. That was when Bradley, the junior finance associate, who still wore pleated trousers like his mother, picked them out for him, spotted the anomaly. Bradley adjusted his glasses and pointed out that the last 4 quarterly rent payments, which totaled $300,000, did not go to our primary landlord, Sandridge Properties. Beatrice demanded to know where they went. Bradley blinked and told her they had been sent to a firm called Stone Lake Holdings, LLC. He pushed the printed invoice across the table. There it was in black and white. Stone Lake Holdings, LLC, with a remittance address in Delaware and an account ending in 0849. The document was signed electronically by our recently retired Chief Financial Officer, Lawrence, and time-stamped with a digital signature that traced directly back to me. Beatrice waved her hand dismissively, claiming it was probably just a third-party payment processor, and told them to call the building management office to clear it up, so they did. Their first phone call went straight to voicemail. The second call was disconnected. The third call was finally answered by the building manager, Gary. But Gary only said 7 words before hanging up the phone. He said, "I can only speak to Peter." That was it. No friendly greeting, no explanation. Just those 7 words, and then the line went dead. Beatrice stood frozen at the head of the table, her lips twitching. Ronald, a quiet board member, who usually only spoke when the coffee pot was empty, leaned forward and asked the critical question. He asked who was actually listed on the lease. The room fell completely silent. Scott typed furiously on his keyboard, trying to retrieve the original agreement. When the document finally surfaced, it revealed that Stone Lake Holdings LLC was listed as the intermediary lessor, and Sandridge was only the primary owner of record. And on the final signature page, the authority was listed under Peter Lawson, managing partner. Nobody in that room knew who Peter Lawson was, but the Human Resources database still had my full name listed as Peter Lawson. Beatrice blinked in confusion, claiming it could be anyone. But Bradley had already printed the business registry from Delaware. The initials matched my digital signature, and the email address attached was a masked alias routed through a domain I had registered 3 years ago for a private real estate consultancy. At that point, it was no longer a question of whether they had made a mistake. It was just a question of how massive the damage was going to be. By 11:30, the lawyers had called the founder, Jeffrey, who was vacationing in Europe. The chief financial officer was sweating through his button-down shirt, and Beatrice was sitting alone at the end of the long conference table, staring at her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. Her pride was a powerful drug, and she was not ready to admit defeat just yet. The boardroom that had once been filled with loud talk of corporate expansion now felt like a quiet church. Everyone was stunned, silent, and waiting for someone else to take the fall. They had no idea what to do next. To understand how we arrived at this corporate checkmate, we have to look back 16 months. I was sitting in a diner just off the state highway, peeling the paper label off a plastic bottle of iced tea, while my attorney, Nancy, scribbled notes on a yellow legal pad. Nancy was wearing dark sunglasses indoors, smelled of cucumber soap, and knew the tax code better than her own phone number. We were the only two people in the diner who were not wearing hunting camouflage. She asked me if I was absolutely certain about doing this. I nodded without hesitation. I had spent nearly 2 decades watching incompetent managers get promoted over me, and I was not about to get pushed out a third time by family members who used internet message boards for strategic planning. Nancy asked if I wanted to register a standard shell company or bury the ownership inside a blind trust. I told her I wanted both. I wanted it to look as boring as possible, a paper trail so dry that any corporate auditor would fall asleep before reaching the second page. We established Stone Lake Holdings LLC that very afternoon, registering the business in Delaware and routing it through a post office box in a quiet town. The employer identification number arrived 2 days later, and we opened a business bank account under a shell trust I had maintained since my father passed away. My father had always told me that if you are going to get kicked in the teeth, you should at least make sure you are wearing steel-toed boots. Nancy handled all the corporate filings, and I drafted the lease agreements. It was clean, simple corporate poetry. There were no mistakes, no logical loopholes, and no room for interpretation. It was the kind of dry legal language that could easily pass through 4 separate corporate departments without raising a single red flag. I had spent 19 years studying their administrative blind spots, and I knew exactly where they did not look. It was never about seeking revenge. It was about creating insulation, protection, and survival in a hostile corporate climate. Now, back in the boardroom, the panic was growing by the minute. The chief financial officer had not blinked this much since our fourth quarter earnings call, when Jeffrey had accidentally used the words financially unstable instead of strategic restructuring. The chief financial officer sat hunched over a pile of spreadsheets, his eyes data points between the payment logs and the lease document that nobody had ever actually read. Because here is the ultimate punchline of the story. They had signed it. The lease agreement we wrote was not forged. It was not slipped into a folder with a magician's trick, and it was not written in invisible ink. It had been sent via email, printed out, signed with a pen, countersigned, and officially approved by the very executives who now claimed they were victims of a crime. The previous chief executive officer, Lawrence, had signed off on the updated facilities agreement just a week before he retired to his new home in Florida. Lawrence is probably playing tennis right now, completely unaware that his final signature gave me the keys to the entire building. The chief financial officer circled the payment terms in red ink, preparing for the legal storm. The agreement clearly stated that rent was to be paid quarterly to Stone Lake Holdings LLC, which acted as the intermediary landlord under the rights outlined in one of the attached exhibits. The language was just generic enough to avoid any scrutiny. The standard rent escalation clause was there, the renewal options were there, and tucked neatly into a small footnote was the crucial phrase: any and all notices to the intermediary landlord must be directed to the authorized representative listed in the appendix. And that appendix pointed directly to my personal email alias. That was when the legal reality finally clicked for their lawyers. Under Delaware General Corporation Law, Section 144, An interested transaction between a company and its employee is not void or voidable if the material facts of the relationship or the contract are disclosed or known to the signing officers, and the contract is fair to the corporation at the time of its approval. The lease rate we had established was actually slightly below the market average at the time, making it undeniably fair to the company. The document had been officially reviewed and signed by Lawrence, the chief executive officer with full corporate authority, and processed by their own finance department for over a year. There was no fraud. There was only their own failure to perform basic due diligence. The chief financial officer looked up at Beatrice and the board members, his face pale. He explained that the contract was completely valid, legally binding, and fully processed. There was no deception on my part. They had simply ignored the details. They had fired the one person who held the lease to their offices, and under the terms of the agreement, Stone Lake Holdings LLC possessed the sole authority to issue lease termination notices, increase the rent, or deny building access based on any breach of contract. Beatrice stood up, her palms flat against the wooden table, and demanded that they strong-arm me into a renegotiation. The chief financial officer just looked down at his papers and whispered that they could not strong-arm the owner of the building. He packed his folders and sat back down, leaving the board members to face the cold truth of their situation. The official phone call came in at exactly 2:11 in the afternoon. I was sitting in my new office, finishing a cinnamon roll and watching the city traffic crawl past my window. The caller identification was blocked, but I answered it anyway. When a number calls you 3 times in 5 minutes, it is never a friendly neighbor. The voice on the other end was dry, clinical, and sounded like someone who had spent too many years reading contracts. He introduced himself as an attorney representing my former employer. He told me they were reviewing the lease agreements and had noticed some inconsistencies. He suggested we have a quick phone call to clear things up. I laughed and asked if he meant the inconsistency where a chief executive officer signs a contract without reading it, or the one where the founder's mother fires her own landlord during a waffle breakfast. The lawyer did not appreciate my sense of humor. He cleared his throat and tried to sound intimidating, mentioning that some parties within the company were interpreting my actions as deceptive. He warned me that there could be grounds for pursuing business fraud charges if the intermediary relationship had not been properly disclosed. I smiled so wide my face hurt. I told him he should probably turn to Section 6.2 of the lease agreement, specifically the indemnity clause. There was a long silence on the line. I explained to him that Section 6.2 indemnified the intermediary landlord from any and all liability arising from the execution of the contract, as long as they operated within the terms of the agreement. I pointed out that the clause was actually taken directly from their own law firm's standard boilerplate language. I had even highlighted it in yellow in the final draft. I told him that unless he wanted to sue his own client for negligence in failing to read a contract they had signed, he should probably hang up and reread the document. He did not say goodbye, he just disconnected the call. 10 minutes later, Timothy sent me a screenshot of an internal message. The lawyers had circulated Section 6.2 with red circles around the text. The contract clearly stated that the intermediary lessor would be held harmless against any claims arising from the tenant's failure to review the documents. I had done everything by the book. Every document was notarized, registered, and filed under Nancy's supervision. There was no fraud. There was only their complete incompetence. By Thursday morning, the physical consequences of their mistake became visible on the street. Employees were dragging ergonomic chairs down the concrete sidewalks, wheeling computer monitors across parking lots, and holding up their cell phones to navigate because the temporary office space they had scrambled to lease was 2 blocks away and lacked basic amenities. The new space had no air conditioning, no working wireless internet, and not enough electrical outlets to run both the servers and the coffee maker. But Beatrice had wanted a leaner operation, and this was certainly lean. They had signed a rushed sublease with a discount commercial broker for a half-finished space above a martial arts gym. But they had failed to check the municipal usage registry, and when the property management system updated, The primary leaseholder for that entire block was listed as Riverside Holdings, LLC. Riverside was another shell company I had registered 14 months earlier, routed through a secure trust. The building manager, a stubborn man named Joseph, flagged the company's access quests the moment he saw the conflict. Joseph flatly informed them that they could not occupy the space because another tenant held priority leasing rights. When Beatrice demanded to know who held the rights, Joseph checked his tablet and told her the name. On the registry was Peter Lawson. Beatrice let out a sound that was half scream and half cuff. She turned to her operations team and accused me of blacklisting them. The staff members just stared at her, unsure of what to do. Scott from the Information Technology Department pretended to work on a router to avoid eye contact. Beatrice began pacing the hallway, screaming that she was going to sue me for harassment and retaliation. She began waving her hands in the air, yelling at the top of her lungs that this was a coordinated conspiracy to ruin her life. She threatened to call the police, the local sheriff, and even the governor's office, claiming that her civil rights were being violated by a rogue former employee. The employees who were standing in the hallway holding heavy boxes of files and office supplies looked at each other in sheer embarrassment. They knew there was no conspiracy. There was only their own management's refusal to read the paperwork before signing the sublease. The problem for her was that I had done absolutely nothing illegal. I had simply been prepared. Riverside Holdings LLC held valid lease options on 3 different properties in that commercial zone, and my name was not even on the public registry. You would have to dig through multiple layers of corporate shells to find my connection. Her public meltdown was recorded by an employee and uploaded to the company message board, with a caption about firing the infrastructure. The board of directors realized they had no choice. They had to either pay whatever rent I demanded, or continue trying to run a multi-million-dollar business from a building with sticky floors and no elevator. Jeffrey, the founder, rushed back from his vacation in the Swiss Alps to call an emergency meeting. He had been completely unaware that his mother's pride had disrupted the entire operation. The emergency board meeting began with nervous throat clearing. Jeffrey, the founder, had returned from his vacation looking relaxed, but that relaxation vanished the moment he saw the chaos. The chief financial officer, sweating profusely, played the video of Beatrice screaming at me during the waffle breakfast. Jeffrey stared at the screen in disbelief. He asked if they had actually terminated me. Scott from the information technology team nodded and explained that I had been dismissed because Beatrice considered my position to be redundant overhead. One of the board members muttered that I was the one who actually ran the company's infrastructure. Jeffrey asked if I had threatened them when I left. The chief financial officer shook his head and explained that I had only asked why our rent payments were going to Stone Lake Holdings, LLC. Jeffrey demanded to know what Stone Lake was, and the company lawyer passed him the registry documents. The lawyer explained that the lease had been restructured under my shell company, signed by the previous chief executive officer, and was completely valid. He added that under the contract terms, I had the sole authority over their offices, and their failure to pay would trigger a clause making the board members individually liable for the financial penalties. The room fell into a heavy silence. Jeffrey looked at his mother and asked how she could have fired the landlord without even reading the lease. Beatrice claimed I was a threat because I had too much control. The lawyer pointed out that I had control because I was the only one who understood how the company operated. The meeting ended without a vote, but when Beatrice walked out, nobody followed Beatrice. Her authority was gone. Later that afternoon, a courier delivered a formal proposal to my new office. The board wanted to renegotiate the lease. They were offering to triple the rent rate and cover all moving costs if I would allow them to return to the building. I read the proposal, smiled, and told the courier to inform them that the new rate would be retroactive for 4 months. An hour later, Brenda from the board called my phone. She sounded exhausted and desperate, explaining that the retroactive clause would deplete their financial reserves. She begged me to accept double the rent instead. I looked out my office window and remembered how they had treated me. 3 years ago, When the chief operating officer position had opened up twice, they had promised me a review. Instead, they hired Keith, a man who did not know the difference between a commercial lease and a rental agreement. Keith lasted 5 months. When they searched for a replacement, I scored the highest on every evaluation. But they bypassed me again to hire Roger, who ended up losing his job after an expense scandal. They had consistently bypassed me, expecting me to keep the company running while they played executive. I told Brenda that if they wanted the office space, they would pay the triple rate retroactively, plus 8% interest, my legal fees, and a $25,000 goodwill fee. She gasped but agreed to wire the money that day. The final meeting took place in the main conference room the following morning. I walked in wearing a new suit, carrying a folder containing the revised lease. The board members looked exhausted. Jeffrey sat at the head of the table, and Beatrice sat next to him, her jaw clenched. I placed the document on the table and told them there was one non-negotiable clause. I looked directly at Jeffrey and told him I would not lease the space to his mother. Beatrice gasped, but I explained that I did not lease property to people who screamed at my staff, called my work redundant, or fired the company's operational infrastructure. The room was silent. Then Ronald, the board member, whispered that I was right. Brenda agreed, pointing out that the company could not afford to lose their offices. Brenda noted that without this space, their operations would grind to a halt within a week, costing them millions of dollars in lost contracts and client lawsuits. The chief financial officer nodded in agreement, pointing out that paying the rent was their only viable option to survive. The survival of the company was on the line, and everyone in the room knew it. The power had shifted completely from the boardroom executives to the quiet administrator they had dismissed. Jeffrey looked at his mother, sighed, and told her it was time for her to step down. Beatrice stared at him in betrayal, then stood up and walked out of the room. I left the folder on the table and told them I would wait in the lobby for the signed copy. 10 minutes later, the contract was returned to me, signed and executed. At noon, Nancy sent me a message confirming that the wire transfer had cleared. The first tripled rent payment, along with the retroactive fees and the goodwill deposit, was in my account. I ordered an expensive lunch from the sushi restaurant the company used to say was too costly for administrative staff. I ate my lunch slowly at the head of the large conference table in my new office, looking out at the city. For 19 years, I had kept their business running from the shadows. Now they were paying me triple just to walk through the doors I owned. It was not just a successful business deal. It was a complete corporate checkmate. I stood up and smiled, knowing that I had finally won the respect I had earned.